Now, we're at the point, of course, that the situation has gotten so bad that this December, Romania straight up canceled the results of a presidential election based on the flimsy suspicions of an intelligence agency and enormous pressure from its continental neighbors. Now, as I understand it, the argument was that Russian disinformation had infected the Romanian elections. But I'd ask my European friends to have some perspective. You can believe it's wrong for Russia to buy social media advertisements to influence your elections. We certainly do. You can condemn it on the world stage even. But if your democracy can be destroyed with a few $100,000 of digital advertising from a foreign country, then it wasn't very strong to begin with.
Vice President J.D. Vance went to Germany to tell European countries that they need to lay off Russia and its consistent disinformation campaigns that influence their elections. His entire job that day was to normalize Russian interference so that more of it can go unchecked. Sounds a lot more like Russia first instead of America first.
Speaking up and expressing opinions isn't election interference. Even when people express views outside your own country, and even when those people are very influential. And trust me, I say this with all humor, if American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk. But what no democracy, American, German, or European, will survive is telling millions of voters that their thoughts and concerns, their aspirations, their pleas for relief are invalid or unworthy of even being considered. Democracy rests on the sacred principle that the voice of the people matters. There's no room for firewalls. You either uphold the principle or you don't.
So now, the richest man in the world, who literally bought the American president and has immediately proceeded to raid our treasury under the cover of darkness, is the same as a teenage Greta Thunberg, who aggressively fought for leaders to focus on policies related to climate change. You know, if you actually stop to listen to the comical arguments that this guy is making, you tune him out so that you can pay attention to the serious people. But his cartoonish comparisons are important to recognize because they exist to distract you from his administration's actual focus of aiding Vladimir Putin's desires in Europe.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. Now, I was struck that a former European commissioner went on television recently and sounded delighted that the Romanian government had just annulled an entire election. He warned that if things don't go to plan, the very same thing could happen in Germany too. Now, these cavalier statements are shocking to American ears. For years, we've been told that everything we fund and support is in the name of our shared democratic values. Everything from our Ukraine policy to digital censorship is billed as a defense of democracy. But when we see European courts canceling elections and senior officials threatening to cancel others, we ought to ask whether we're holding ourselves to an appropriately high standard. And I say ourselves because I fundamentally believe that we are on the same team. We must do more than talk about democratic values. We must live them.
So there they go again, talking about a threat from within. The same language Donald Trump repeatedly used against Americans that refused to buy his obviously empty populism. Why should Europeans give a damn what J.D. Vance thinks about their values that he claims he shares with them? Everything this administration says is based on their declaration that they have principles and values, but those standards are never exhibited. The only objective here was to try to convince anyone listening that suddenly Russia and China are of no concern, simply because J.D. Vance and Donald Trump said so. And while he's complaining about what these countries have done to their elections, he's hoping no one remembers that after his wannabe dictator lost an election, he never conceded, but literally directed his supporters in the streets to attack the Capitol. There are no principles, values, or standards anywhere in his pompous and superiority-driven rhetoric. This Putin-supporting administration also sent its newly confirmed defense secretary to NATO headquarters in Brussels to defend their plan to represent Russia in what they're calling negotiations to end the country's aggression into Ukraine.
You have focused on what Ukraine is giving up. What concessions will Putin be asked to make?
I would start by saying the arguments that have been made that somehow coming to the table right now is making concessions to Vladimir Putin outright that we otherwise, or that the president of the United States shouldn't otherwise make. I just reject that at its face.
Now pause for a second. The question was, what concessions will Putin be asked to make? But to avoid angering the Russian leader, Hegseth falsely recreated the simple question to mean that coming to the table is making concessions to him, so that he could outright reject the straw man that he just built. So now watch him go into MAGA campaign mode to promote and exalt Donald Trump as some Superman figure that made everything happen. You know, when nothing has actually happened yet.
There's a reason why negotiations are happening right now, just a few weeks after President Trump was sworn in as President of the United States. Vladimir Putin responds to strength. In 2014, he invaded Crimea, not during the presidency of Donald Trump. Over 4 years, there was no Russian aggression from 2016 to 2020. In 2022, Vladimir Putin took aggression on Ukraine. Once again, not while President Trump was president of the United States. So any suggestion that President Trump is doing anything other than negotiating from a position of strength is on its face ahistorical and false. So when you look at what he may have to give or take, what's in or what's out in those negotiations, we have the perfect deal maker at the table from a position of strength to deal with both Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. No one's going to get everything that they want. Understanding who committed the aggression in the first place. But I challenge anyone else to think of a world leader at this moment who, with credibility and strength, could bring those two leaders to the table and forge a durable peace that ultimately serves the interests of Ukraine, stops the killing and the death, which Trump has been clear he wants to do, and hopefully ultimately is guaranteed by strength of Europeans who are there prepared to back it up.
The idea is to keep the illusion alive that Donald Trump is running the show, to create the idea that no matter what comes of these negotiations, he got his way. These guys have thrived off of being completely incompetent and avoiding accountability with their base by employing the shield of alternative facts that Kellyanne Conway fed supporters 8 years ago.
These negotiations are led by President Trump. Everything is on the table in his conversations with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. What he decides to allow or not allow is at the purview of the leader of the free world, of President Trump. So I'm not going to stand at this podium and declare what President Trump will do or won't do, what will be in or what will be out, what concessions will be made or what concessions are not made.
In other words, Hegseth nor President Trump really know what the negotiations will look like, and neither wants to draw any lines in the sand with Putin. Because, as the president illustrated right after he was elected, he doesn't know what to do until Vladimir Putin tells him what to do.
Do you believe that Ukraine should cede territory to Russia?
Well, I'm going to let you know that after I have my first meeting. But a lot of that territory, when you look at what's happened to those, I mean, there are cities that there's not a building standing. It's a demolition site. There's not a building standing. So people can't go back to those cities. There's nothing there. It's just rubble. Just like when I knocked down a building in Manhattan.
All anyone has to notice from that answer is that he doesn't know if the country that was invaded should cede territory until he speaks to the leader of the invading country. All the rest of that bullshit answer about a demolition site that he knows a lot about because he's involved in real estate is just filler to cover for his vacuous presence. And his defense secretary is the only one clueless enough to carry that same message without even blinking.
I can look, as our team has, at what's realistic, likely on an outcome. I think realism is an important part of the conversation that hasn't existed enough inside conversations amongst friends. But simply pointing out realism, like the borders won't be rolled back to what everybody would like them to be in 2014, is not a concession to Vladimir Putin. It's a recognition of the hard power realities on the ground after a lot of investment and sacrifice, first by the Ukrainians and then by allies, and then a realization that a negotiated peace is going to be some sort of demarcation that neither side wants. But it's not my job as the Secretary of Defense to define the parameters of the President of the United States as he leads some of the most complex and consequential negotiations in the world.
So it's pretty clear that this administration, from Donald Trump to J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth, are taking their blanket support for Vladimir Putin's interests on the international stage. Vance is pushing his interests in interfering in others' elections, while Hegseth is championing his desires to take land through aggression, all because the president is enamored by his genius plan to invade the country and take what he wants.
I said, this is genius. Putin declares a big portion of Ukraine. Putin declares it as independent. Oh, that's wonderful. So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that? And he's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. That's the strongest peace force. We could use that on our southern border. That's the strongest peace force I've ever seen. There were more army tanks than I've ever seen. They're going to keep peace all right.
Just to be clear, do you see any future in which Ukraine returns to its pre-2014 borders?
Well, I think Pete said today that that's unlikely, right? It certainly would seem to be unlikely. They took a lot of land, and they fought for that land, and they lost a lot of soldiers.